And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Looking at tonight's weather again, got this low pressure area taking a turn to the southeast here, just off the central and south coast. So the heaviest precipitation will be over the southern panhandle as this tracks in toward the Queen Charlotte Islands, followed by high pressure with drying and clearing into the central interior. And the next system out here to the west, pushing rain in toward the southwest coast and the Alaska Peninsula. Big area precipitation covering a good portion of the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. This low up here to the northwest keeps it kind of unsettled up there and slowly weakens in place. We'll see for tomorrow, still there, but much weaker now. Still some shower activity with it and cloudy skies, but a lot of sunshine breaking out here over the central interior, all the way down into Cook Inlet and the Kenai Peninsula, eastward over toward the border. Rain here with this front pushing into Bristol Bay now. Not too far inland, probably staying west of the Kuskokwim Valley, but definitely into Bristol Bay and the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, and then back to the west here, becoming showery over the central Aleutians. And rain with this system pushing up toward Kodiak Island, and much drier day in store for the Panhandle. Next day, that system tracks northeast, bringing another round of increasing wind and rain in toward the southeast coast. And this low tracks up in toward the Aleutian Range in Bristol Bay, and the trough extending northeast from that. All three combined to make for a cloudy, wet day over southern half of the state with a chance of precipitation all the way up to the Brooks Range and still on the western Arctic coast, North Slope areas. And the next system farther to the west, bringing increasing wind and rain to the western Aleutians and Bering. For the coastal water forecasts here for Tuesday, northeast winds, 15 knots on the central and south coast. And for the north coast, northwest at 15 knots. Light north winds at 10 knots for Lynn Canal and Stevens Passage, northwest at 15, but southeast winds 15 knots for Clarence Strait. And then for the day Wednesday, got small craft advisories here for the central coast. South winds 25 to 30 knots with that next system approaching with gale force winds here on the north coast of 35 to 45 knots from the south and east. Southeast 15, Lincoln Island Glacier Bay, southeast 20 knots there for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, northwest winds 15 knots. Prince William Sound, northwest winds at 10 knots with seas at 2 feet. Otherwise, variable winds for the North Gulf Coast, 10 to 15 knots, seas 2 to as high as 8 feet. Barren Islands, southwest at 20 knots, variable at 20 for Kamishak Bay. Cook Inlet, light variable winds for the day Tuesday, seas only at about 2 feet. And then for Wednesday, big increase in the winds here for Prince William Sound. East, 30 knots, seas building to 6 feet. Eastern North Gulf Coast, gale warnings with east winds, 35 to 45 knots and 12-foot seas. Northeast at 30 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. Barren Islands, east winds 40 knots, seas close to 10 feet. And small craft advisory, southern Cook Inlet for north winds at 25 knots, just 15-knot northerlies north of the Forelands. And for the Alaska Peninsula tomorrow, south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, southeast 15 for Bristol Bay and Kodiak Island, looking at variable to south winds 15 to 20 knots. And for the day Wednesday, Kodiak Island, south to southwest wind 15 to 20 knots. Northwest winds 25 knots or west-northwest winds 25 knots for the Alaska Peninsula with the seas 6 to 9 feet. Northwest 25 for Bristol Bay, seas 4 feet. And then for Wednesday, small craft advisories continue for Bristol Bay, northwest 25 knots, west-northwest 25 for the Alaska Peninsula. Kodiak Island south to southwest at 15 to 20 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, south winds 20 knots, 5 to 7 foot seas, Adak and Atka, small craft advisories, northwest winds 25 knots. And then an area of gale force northwest winds at 35 knots, say west of Adak to about Kamchatka Island and Amchitka Island, northwest 30 for the western Aleutians. And then for the day Wednesday, gale warnings here for the western Aleutians, south to southwest, 35 to 40 knots. Central Aleutians west at 30 knots and northwest winds 30 knots for the eastern Aleutians. And for the Kuskokwim Delta coast for tomorrow, Tuesday, southeast at 25, lighter up here to the north. Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, 15-knot winds out of the east, variable at 15 for the Pribilofs, and northeast winds 30 knots with 10-foot seas around St. Matthew Island. Then for Wednesday, gale warnings, Pribilofs, northwest 35 knots, seas at 13 feet, northwest 30 knot winds for St. Matthew Island, small craft advisory St. Lawrence Island, and the southwest coast for northerly winds at 25 knots, north at about 20 for Norton Sound. And for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east winds 5 to 15 knots, Chukchi Sea, south winds 15 knots, 3 to 6 foot seas. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast looking at west to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. And then those turn easterly for the eastern coast there on Wednesday at 10 to 15 knots. 5 knot east winds on the central coast, northeast at 10 for the west side, and the Chukchi Sea north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots.